Okay, hi everyone. So we're finally done with muscular tissue, and now we can actually move on to skeletal muscle anatomy. So everything you think of when you talk about muscles, or if you like to go to the gym, these are the muscles. These include the muscles you are very enthusiastic about. Okay, so then what we have here. So how many muscles are there in the human body? This is a common question. So we know there are 206 human or bones in the human body. But Martini, so the Fundamentals of A&P book, that they say approximately 700. And this number is often or thrown around 640 to 650. I've seen this number thrown, I mean, if you just Google how many muscles are there in the human body, you often see this 640, 650 number. And I found one resource, but I was trying to find like, okay, is there actually a list of all the 640 muscles? And then there's a official Terminologia Anatomica. So this is like the official international resource and nomenclature and naming of everything anatomy. And depends whether you consider, notice that I have this number from 650 to 800 plus. So where does that 800 plus number come from? Well, it depends if you consider a group of muscles as one muscle, or if you consider each head or each separate part of a muscle, or in a group of muscles as a separate muscle. So this is why there's a huge range. Now, the big question is that's probably on your mind. Do I want you to have one of these numbers? So what happens, like especially when we get to neuroscience and the nervous system, whenever there's like a broad disagreement or there's varying sources have very different numbers like we have here, I do not test you on it. Because again, I'm just letting you know that it's, well, what do we see here? It's definitely somewhere between 600 and 800. And in fact, your OpenStax textbook just says a large number. I tried looking, maybe I overlooked it, but it doesn't actually say a number. It just says a large number. So whenever there's an active disagreement in like a number or things aren't totally clear, I don't test you on it. But these things are pretty consistent. It's somewhere between 600 and 800, and it's definitely way larger. The number of muscles is way greater than the number of bones in your body. So again, I think it's kind of like, well, I wouldn't say it's trivia, but I think there's more important things to focus on than just some number. Okay, so there are general rules of how muscles operate. So what we have here, hey, flexion and extension, so joint movements. But now we're going to talk in this chapter about what is actually moving the joints. So muscles attach to at least two sites. So sometimes they attach to more than two sites. But of these two sites, at least one is what you call an origin, and another one is called an insertion. So origin is like, when you think of an origin, it's like the beginning of something. Or if you remember all the way from like high school algebra, when you have the x and y axis, the origin is the start. So it's like zero. So, but origin is the attachment point that stays in place. So if you go back to your origins, you go back to where you came from, and you go back home, right? So the origin is something that anchors a muscle. And then an insertion, well, it's kind of like the origin is kind of casting the line and then inserting on some other part of the body. So typically in skeletal muscle, it's somewhere on the skeleton. Sometimes it might be a softer tissue in other types of muscles, but again, what we have here, the origin stays in place, and the insertion is the attachment point. So again, notice that it doesn't say only skeleton. So sometimes you do have non-bone insertions. And then what happens? Well, the insertion moves toward the origin. So that's why it's very important to know that the origin stays in place. Now, here's an example. So again, the origin is trying to stay in place, and here's the insertion. And if this is the muscle contracting, notice that the insertion is moving toward the origin. Now, insertions pull toward origins. That is a law of muscles. Again, it's not just randomly like saying, okay, this is the origin, this is insertion. So this is an important concept, that the origin is the anchor and the insertion is being pulled toward the origin. Now, what do we have here? So here, if we have the insertion and it's down here, and then if this is the muscle and the origin is up here, what happens when this muscle contracts right here? Again, the insertion pulls toward the origin. So this muscle right here, we call the biceps brachii. What will it do to the elbow joint? What will it do to the forearm at the elbow joint? It will bring it closer, right? So this is why the biceps brachii is one of the arms or one of the muscles that aids in the flexion of the arm at the elbow joint. So the thing is that individual muscles pull, they do not push. Because why? When the muscle contracts, you have actin and myosin, and what do? They contract and they do this, right? So they shorten. So this is why they pull and they don't push. Now, if you go to the gym a lot, you may, if you've done like a split of your exercises, you may say, oh, today's a pull day, where I just do back and biceps, and the next day is a push day where I do things like chest presses. But the thing is that even though we taught things or things like push-ups, we think of it as a push muscular movement that pushes something. But actually, it's a combination of movements that move your arms in the overall like push direction. But things like your pectoralis major, it's actually shortening and bring your shoulder closer. So that's kind of adding to the forward movement. But also things like your triceps. So things that it's not only your triceps are contracting, they are shortening, but they're also extending your arms when you're doing a push-up. So sometimes you might have a pushing motion, but it's actually due to the contraction of multiple muscles actually doing that overall push movement. But individually, all those muscles are pulling. Okay, so then here we have sarcomeric shortening. So this, in this previous picture back in the previous chapter, what we have here is a myofiber and myofibrils. And then what we have here is that when it contracts, it shortens. Now this is showing just a random myofibril that's not anchored to anything. But again, what did we just talk about? We just talked about origins and insertions, right? So typically you have a myofiber muscle cell attached to an origin, or multiple myofibers attached to origin in a muscle belly, and then what happens here is that you have it inserting to something. And yes, it's a crewmate bone, but this is just an example. So what we have here is the origin, and again, which pulls towards which? Do insertions pull toward origins, or do origins pull toward insertions? Again, the origin is where the starting point is. It's the anchor. So when this contracts, it will pull the insertion toward the origin. So this is what drives a lot of the skeletal muscle movements and joint movements. So again, insertions pull toward origins. This is a law. Okay, so here we have two groups of muscles, or actually I think they're just showing two muscles, but here are flexors and extensors. So which muscle do you think when it contracts will induce, actually this is the elbow joint, so which muscle do you think it's this muscle here toward the anterior or the posterior that when it contracts will cause flexion? Pause the video and think about it for a few seconds. Okay, so just remember, muscles shorten and they pull, right? So what happens if this one pulls right here? Well, it'll shorten this muscle, and what will happen to the distance between this bone and this bone? It will shorten, right? And as it shortens and shortens, this bone gets lifted up and up and up and up, right? So it makes sense that these muscles here are flexors, because if they shorten, they'll bring this bone closer to up here. So again, remember, origins pull toward insertion. Insertions pull toward origins. Got myself clear. Yeah, it's before coffee. But again, origins are the anchor. So here we have the insertion right here on the radius, and it's pulling toward the origins up here. Now, what do we have here? So what muscle will cause extension? Will the same one cause extension? Well, again, which when it contracts will actually move this bone closer to this direction? Well, notice that, again, this muscle right here is attaching to this part of the olecranon, right? So when it shortens, what will it do? It'll decrease the difference, or the distance between this point and this point up here. So as it shortens, it'll pull this part, and as it pulls this part, the rest of the bone will come along for the ride. So what you know is that the extensors tend to be located on the side of extension, whereas the flexors, they tend to be located on the side of flexion. And that kind of makes sense. If you understand that muscles shorten and they're decreasing the distance between areas, then it makes sense that you would generally have muscles that contribute to a motion on the same side of that motion. Notice that the flexion is toward the anterior at the elbow joint, and the flexors would be toward the anterior as well. Whereas extensors of the elbow joint, well, they are toward the extension of the elbow joint is toward the posterior. So it makes sense that those extensors are toward the posterior as well, because again, you're shortening the distance. You want it closer. Okay, so this is something that I think the OpenStax kind of like glosses over, and it is a pretty tricky concept at first when we talk about the three classes of levers. So first class, second class, and third class. There are only three classes of levers, but what are the different classes? So the thing is that what we have here, oh my god, you may be like, what's a fulcrum? What's a force? What's a load? Especially if you haven't had physics, this might be a little tough to grasp at first, but I'm going to go very general. So a layman's term of person's version of load is just some weight being moved. So again, your body has weight, it has mass, and your skeletal muscles move that mass. So where is the weight distribution in a muscle's action? Where's the weight that needs to be moved? That's what they're referring to with load. And the fulcrum is some sort of pivot or joint. So again, here we have the atlanto-occipital joint. And what we have here is that this is the pivot. This is the fulcrum right here. So this is the joint right there. And applied force, so when it's in these figures, when it says applied force, it's referring to the force generated when a muscle contracts. And what we have here is a first class lever. So what's the first class lever? Well, here they use a pry bar. Here's the pivot, and here's the weight you want to move, and here's the muscular force. Well, in your atlanto-occipital joint, what's happening here? Well, everything from this point from the joint anterior is a weight. So what happens if you just like relax your neck and let it sink forward? It just goes forward, right? But what happens if you contract these muscles like the semispinalis capitis and splenius capitis back here? Well, it's going to contract and shorten, right? So what's it going to do? It's going to lift this load. So it's also kind of like, they use this example of a pry bar, but first class lever is kind of like a seesaw. So you have that pivot, you have that joint in the middle, and you have the weight on one end. And if something moves it on the other end, the weight moves up and down. So this is a first class lever. It's like probably the simplest one. Now, second class lever takes a little imagination. So what we have here is that the pivot is now at one end, and the applied force from the muscle is on the other end, and the weight is in the middle. So here we have the gastrocnemius and the soleus right here. So look at your calf muscles. So notice that this load right here is pretty much the weight of the body. So here is the ball of the foot, that's the pivot. And here are the muscles. And notice that they're on the most posterior they're posterior compared to the weight distribution of the body. So when these muscles contract, they shorten this between, again, the calcaneus and up here on the femur, and also the tibia as well. And what happens is that this shortens the distance, this brings it up, so it lifts the whole body up. So when you do like a calf raise or go on your tiptoes, that's what you're using. You're using a second class lever. And in the second class lever, again, the fulcrum on this side and the applied force on the other side with the weight in the middle. Now, third class lever, so the majority of your body, or the majority of your skeletal muscles in your body are third class levers. So remember, in the first class lever, you have the pivot, the fulcrum in the middle. Second class, you have the weight in the middle, the load in the middle. And now you notice that the force is in the middle of the fulcrum and the load. And what we have here, so here the load would be pretty much everything here anterior of the biceps brachii here. And here we have the fulcrum, your elbow joint, right? Your humeral ulnar joint. So what happens is that when this contracts, what does it do? It moves this and it brings all this weight upwards. So a third class lever, so this most of the muscles in your body, like if I had to take all the muscles in the body, put them in a bag, and then draw out one, chances are I would draw a muscle that's a third class lever. So again, this is the most common type of lever in your body. And this is like a real life example, a catapult, where you have the pivot here, the load here, and then the applied force here. So I like to think of it this way. A nice mnemonic is like third class lever. Imagine yourself doing curls. I know some of you can curl much more than this, but think of yourself curling a simple 3-pound weight, because that's the only ones available for sale right now because we have that weight shortage. So again, you're curling 3-pound weight because why? Your biceps brachii is an example of a third class lever. Okay, so the types of lever in the body. So what are the differences between the first, second, and third? So the way I, instead of just saying, okay, it's load, fulcrum, force, because actually first class lever can also be, I mean, depends on where you're oriented. It's like if it's force, fulcrum, load, it's still a first class lever. So how many skulls do you have? You only have one skull, right? So the skull and the atlanto-occipital joint is a classic example of a first class lever. And then how many legs? And apologies if you have a, okay, if you're an amputee, pretend you have a prosthetic. But typically, how many legs do you have? 2, right? So again, you have 2 legs, you have 2 calf muscles. So the calf muscles are example of a second class lever. And then third class lever. So say you're doing, again, do that thought experiment or do that imagination exercise where you're lifting an imaginary 3-pound weight. Why? Because their biceps brachii is a classic example of a third class lever. And notice what's the difference between all of these? What I do when I focus, when I was studying, okay, what's the first class, what's the second class, what's the third class? I use those real life analogies like they talk about with like the seesaw, with the wheelbarrow, and I think they use salad tongs for, that's the one I knew for third. But what's the difference? Well, it's what's in the middle. Again, the first class is like that seesaw where the pivot's in the middle. Second class is where the weight is in the middle. And third class is when the force, the muscular force, in this case, is in the middle. So which is in the middle? If it's fulcrum, it's first. It's load, it's second. It's force, it's third. All right, so back to, again, you have to know the skeletal muscles of levels of organization. Remember that myofibrils, these are these complexes of thick and thin filaments. And again, the myofiber has many of these myofibrils, the proteins. And then when you have a fascicle, it's a group of these myofibers. And remember, myofibers are elongated skeletal muscle cells. And when you have a bunch of fascicles, they make up a muscle organ and sometimes called a muscle belly. So here is a fascicle. So let's talk about, what about fascicles? Well, fascicles can have multiple arrangements. They're not always just linear bundles of fibers. So what we have here is the OpenStax version, and talking about the different shapes you might find fascicles arranged in. And here's a circular muscle. So fascicles, they don't have to be linear. They can actually form a string, or actually like a ring right here. So what happens is that relaxes. Remember, when a muscle contracts, it shortens, right? So it's like if you have a circular muscle like this, as it contracts, what happens? It starts to draw closer and closer and closer and smaller, right? It's kind of like a purse string. When you kind of draw it together, it closes that hole that was opening that pouch. So things like your orbicularis oris. So orbicularis, again, orbit, it's kind of like referring to a circular orbit shape. And this is a classic example of circular muscle. And it's not just, and the thing is that they're sometimes also called sphincters as well. So sphincters are circular muscles. We also talk about more sphincters more in PHYL 142, but just FYI that circular muscles are sometimes called sphincters. And then we have parallel muscles. So all the way back to high school geometry, remember that when something's parallel, there are like 2 lines that never intersects. They're side by side by side by side, right? So when you have parallel muscles, you have the fascicles, but they're running side by side. So here's a fascicle, again, a group of those myofibers, individual elongated muscle cells. And then here we have something called fusiform parallel. And fusiform I put in parentheses because, okay, do I want you to memorize which one are fusiform, which are not? I think I just want you to know what fusiform means. So these fibers and fascicles are all parallel, but they end up tapering off. So this is why things like the biceps brachii, especially for people who have really developed arms, when they kind of contract, they have that little, that baseball, that little bulge right there. So it kind of bulges out but tapers off, but they're still parallel. They're not actually converging. And then things like the rectus abdominis, and in this case here we see an 8-pack. So this is what we have here, a non-fusiform parallel. So it's more like a sheet. Instead of having a bulge and tapering off, they run parallel, and it's more like a flat sheet than actually being fusing together and tapering off. So things like the rectus abdominis. And here's another example of a wrapping parallel muscle like the supinator. It doesn't actually taper off. It actually stays pretty parallel and doesn't bulge and then taper off at one end. So that's the difference between fusiform and non-fusiform. And these are parallel. So if I do ask you, so here's another thing. I know a lot of people are concerned with the exam. If I have it on the lecture slides, these are more likely to appear than muscles that I never cover at all. But okay, so then here we have the convergent muscles. So when something converges, it kind of comes to, or you have multiple things and they end up converging on one point. So they come from different directions and they come together at one point. So con means together in this case. So things like the pectoralis major, and what you notice is that the pectoralis major actually has a really broad base and origin. And what we have here are all the fascicles. So notice that all these fascicles, this is the origin over here, and all the fascicles are inserting on this part right here. So this is the tendon that inserts onto the insertion. And what we have here, again, all these fascicles and they're converging onto a single tendon right here. Then you have pennate muscles. Now this is kind of funny because the pennate muscles, okay, this is where you really have to understand that tendons are important for muscles, but again, tendons, these are dense, regular connective tissue containing a lot of collagen, but they're not actually contractile. They're very strong, but they don't do the contracting. So here's the extensor digitorum, and here's the extended tendon. Again, the tendon, that very dense, very strong connective tissue that contains a lot of that collagen. Now, what about the fascicles? Do they run parallel to this? And what we see with a pennate muscle is typically the fascicle, or in a pennate muscle, what happens is the fascicles are kind of to an angle. They're kind of obliquely slanted to the rest of the muscle. So pennate, I think, comes from a Latin term meaning pinna, means feather. So this one kind of does look like a feather. You have that like central vein to a feather, and you have all those little like other parts of, zoology fail. I forgot what you call the feather part besides the central vein. You gotta look that up later. So this is a unipennate. Why? Because it has one extended tendon, and it has all the fascicles are on one side of this tendon. Now there's something called bipennate, and a classic example is the rectus femoris. So what we have here is that we have a central tendon running along the length, but notice that you have all these fascicles on both sides. So again, what does the term bi mean? Again, that bi is a prefix meaning two. So like a bicycle has two wheels, a bipennate. So you have a unipennate here with just uni meaning one, like a unicycle has one wheel. A bipennate has these fascicles on both sides of a central tendon. And then there are things called multipennate muscles. Classic example is the deltoid. Now it's only showing the superficial anatomy right here, but it's showing a cross section, and this central part right here, it's not cartilage. These are actually central tendons. So I wish they had another picture of the deltoid like cut or dissected. So if you actually took apart a deltoid and looked at the tendons and kind of looked at the deeper layers of the deltoid, so what you would see are central tendons, but you see all these many fascicles like arranged like this. So again, common thing in all pennate muscles, notice that these fascicles, they're connected to the central tendon, but they're always kind of at an angle. And yeah, the multipennate ones, these are the most elaborate, but again, still they're at an angle to a central tendon. So this central tendon is kind of a classical feature of these multipennate, or actually when you have a tendon in the middle of all these fascicles. But pennate muscles, even though they're not parallel and they do lose a little of they do contribute to the overall force. But the thing is that with the pinnate muscle, you're able to pack more fascicles than in a parallel muscle. So again, these you might be like, oh my god, they look all the same. They all have fascicles. They all have lines. So parallel versus convergent versus pinnate. So what I'm going to show is like this is the overall. This is rectus abdominis, and when you contract this muscle, this is the overall movement direction of the movement. And what you notice is that all the fascicles are parallel to that overall direction of a movement. Now convergent, here's the direction of movement when you contract the pectoralis major. And what we have here is that it starts here. This is the insertion where all the fascicles converge, but they all pull and kind of radiate out toward the same general direction. And then pinnate, what we have here is that this is the direction of the rectus femoris, but again, it's not parallel. There are all these fibers, all these are actually, and fascicles. They're arranged in some sort of slant and angle that's oblique to the direction of movement. So again, these are the differences between these fascicle arrangements. And if you look at their cross sections, remember parallel ones, you won't have the fascicles intersecting and weaving, whilst converging, notice that, hey, you don't really have like them. Sometimes actually they can also form a sheet as well, and that's what we see here. And for a multi-pinnate here, we see that the tendons are sometimes actually embedded within all the fascicles. Now let's talk about actions and movements. So actions and movements. So here are key vocabulary. So when you think of prime mover, sometimes called agonist. Like I think depending on your textbook, they might use one term or the other, but know that they're synonymous. So it's a main driver or main muscle that causes a movement. So this is the one generating the most force behind joint movement. And then an antagonist is a muscle that does the opposite movement. So there's no such thing as a protagonist muscle. There's an agonist and antagonist. And actually, agonists and antagonists are two very good or useful general terms if you're going to pharmacology. Agonist causes something, antagonist opposes something. So what we have here is like, but again, if we think of like a prime mover, what's the prime hero of a movie? And the antagonist is the person trying to oppose that hero, right? So like think of it this way, and I'm apologize for the smileys, but I want to make Disney mad, so I'm trying to avoid them taking down our educational videos. So here we have so here's a prime mover. They're the one that moves the movie along, and so like a protagonist moves the movie along. Prime mover is the star of a movement. It's the one that moves the main driver behind the movement. Whereas an antagonist, that's the muscle that's opposing the agonist. So it's like the antagonist in the story. They're opposing the main hero, the main mover. Now, the thing is that in a typical story, what do you have? Do you only have maybe in a very simple story, you might have a protagonist and an antagonist, but you typically have side characters, right? So what helps along a prime mover or agonist? You have synergists. So these are muscles that help the prime mover. So they're helping this prime mover right here achieve the overall objective and movement. So they're kind of like these people right here, right? In that movie I'm not going to name. They're kind of helping move the story along, helping the agonist, helping the prime mover. But the thing is that not only, so these are like general categories and definitions regarding a certain joint movements, and then fixators. These are muscles that help with stabilizing the movement. So things that the fixators, they are often isometrically contracting. So because they're not actually changing in length, they're not actually causing a change in angle. But does that mean they're not important? Fixators are important because they help in moving they help in increasing the efficiency over the overall movement. So just like how we have side characters that aren't really like this character right here, they're there. They help the story along, but do they actually help the overall movement? Kind of, sort of, but they're not as like a prominent role. But they're still important in their own respects. So fixators are kind of like that. Now fixators, or if you've done this exercise, like especially if you've like, and at least I remember from PE back when I was like in grade school and high school, is that when you had like someone, is it easier to do a crunch when you're just doing it by yourself without anybody holding your ankles or feet, or with someone holding your feet? typically it's easier when you have someone fixating and kind of helping to stabilize your overall movement. And the thing is, like, whether you have someone there or not, you're still doing that abdominal crunch. You're still doing that overall flexion movement. But if you have something fixating it, it helps increase the efficiency of that movement. So fixators, they're important because they stabilize movement, even though they're not really moving, and it's not moving right here. They kind of help to stabilize the movement, and they make it more efficient. But what if you didn't have fixators? So let's do a little example like here. So with fixators, here's someone hopping a fence. Now, here's someone trying to jump a fence, but they don't have their fixators engaged. So same attempt at the same movement, but this guy's not engaging his core or his other muscles, right? And if you live in the dorms, this probably will look very familiar to you. So again, fixators are important because again, they help with even though they're isometric and they're contracting and not really changing the length or angle of the movement, they are helping to stabilize the origin and increase the efficiency of the movement. All right, so here's a guy doing an exercise, and what movement is he going to do? So what movement is going to move his arms at the shoulder joint? So he went from here, and now he's up here. So what movement is that? Pause the video and think about it. Okay, so he's doing shoulder abduction. So again, he's taking his arms away from his midline. He's abducting his arms. So the prime mover and agonist for this are the deltoids. So these right here, his shoulder muscles. And the antagonist, what will oppose that? If he tries to do his deltoid or contract his deltoid, but he's also contracting his chest and back. That's actually going to bring his shoulder closer to his midline. So those are antagonists. So sometimes it's not always just one antagonist. Sometimes you actually have multiple muscles that can draw the same joint and same joint in the opposite direction. Then you have synergists like the supraspinatus, again, rotator cuff muscles, and then fixators, rhomboids, and I put among many because I didn't want this whole slide to be just all the fixators and all these words on the slide. So the thing is that typically when you have these lists with the movement and the prime movers, the antagonists, the synergists, and the fixators, they typically have long laundry lists, and I'll tell you my expectations for them later. Okay, so the thing is that there are general rules of the muscular system. Remember that individual muscles, they pull, they don't push, even though our overall movement might be a pushing movement. Each of those single muscles by themselves, they are contracting and they're pulling. And here's another general rule. If their muscle does an action, there are muscles that oppose it. So here we have shoulder abduction, and again, so what we have here is that now, as if she's doing this exercise, she's taking her arms and she's adding it back to her midline. She's doing shoulder adduction. So notice that the prime movers is not just like in the front. So she has her pec majors up here, and then she also has her lats in the back. So they're both going to take the arm and shoulder and move the arms back to her midline. And then antagonists, deltoids. Remember, deltoid, when it contracts, it's actually going to shorten this distance and move her arm off to the side. And synergists include like some of the rotator cuff muscles, like the infraspinatus and teres minor. And fixators, these are also things that sometimes muscle can be both a synergist and a fixator. So depending on your textbook as well. Okay, but what am I getting at here? So again, this is shoulder abduction. He's taking his arms away from the midline and moving his shoulder joint. And shoulder adductions, so the movement of the arm at the shoulder joint, adding her arms together toward the midline. So the prime mover and agonist for shoulder abduction were his deltoids right here, right? And what were the antagonists? Then you have the pec major and the lat dorsi in the anterior and posterior. Now with shoulder adduction, what do we have here is that the prime movers are the pectoralis major and the latissimus dorsi, and the antagonists were the deltoids. So this is very interesting. Remember, abduction and adduction are opposites. We have the same joint right here, opposite movements. And what do you notice about the prime movers and agonists and the antagonists? Notice that between the opposing movements, they are switched. So this is when, so I don't really expect you to memorize, like go through every single type of joint movement, memorize these lists of prime movers and antagonists and synergists and fixators. But this is a clever trick. There are two movements and they're opposed, when you know the prime mover and agonist on one, you know the antagonist to the other, and vice versa. So it kind of, you get 2 for 1 by just switching it around because they're opposite movements. So this kind of a study tip. Okay, so then here's another example of a movement, and here we have a simple dumbbell curl, right? But what do you call that movement of the arm, the forearm at the elbow joint? What type of movement we call that? We call that elbow flexion. And prime mover and agonist, so here we have brachialis and biceps brachii. I put an asterisk there. I think Martini, I forgot if it said like, so the lab book says it's brachialis. I think Martini said biceps brachii. I think OpenStax said biceps brachii. I have to look again. But the thing is that, depending on the source, do not worry for this class. Again, this is another example of my general philosophy. If there's kind of like a controversy or mixed signals from official sources, I make you aware of it, but I probably don't test you on it. And the antagonist is pretty well skipped. Again, we talked about the muscles in the front and causing flexion, and in this case, and the antagonist, the triceps brachii on the opposite side of the arm are going to undo that action. So synergists, again, this is why I had the asterisk, because like, again, some textbooks say brachialis is the prime mover and the biceps brachii is a synergist, whereas other textbooks say the biceps brachii is the prime mover and the brachialis is the synergist. So again, don't worry about that for this, at least the lecture. And then if your TA is testing on that, go with what the TA says. And then fixators, or actually not just your TAs, but if you go to advanced classes, don't say Dr. Ia said that we don't know which way. Just favor them. I mean, that's one thing in college in general. Even if there's a controversy and your professor is very strong on an opinion on something, just go with it and be aware that there are other sources that say other things. You can take that on later on in life. But again, if you just want to test, just go with what the professor says. And then fixators, rhomboid major, again, among many. Again, if I'm saying among many, that's a big hint that, do I want you to know all the fixators of elbow flexion? Not for this class. Again, if you're taking the upper limb, or like if you're going to PT, yeah, you gotta know all of that. So, but for this introductory level, not really. Okay, so again, this is why I'm bringing it up, this type of movement, because different resources sometimes disagree. When you see these lists of all the prime movers, antagonists, synergists, and fixators for different types of joint movements, you might get differences between primary literature, resources, textbooks, or what your professors say. And then lists of synergists and fixators can be lengthy. Again, I'm going to try to this is a tough thing about teaching this part of the course, is that there are so many muscles. There's no way you can really, I think that's more something that happens in the 300 or graduate level, where you do have to know these lists of synergists and fixators. But for this class, my main hope for all of you is that you are able to actually identify these muscles. And you should know the definitions of prime movers, antagonists, synergists, and fixators. Okay, so then what we have here, opposing muscles, flexion, and extension. So again, what I'm showing here is, in our previous example, notice that the muscles that aid in flexion, they're closer to the flexion at the elbow joint is toward the anterior, and the flexors are, not by coincidence, remember, muscles shorten. So it makes sense to have the flexors toward the anterior side because you're shortening this distance. Whereas extensors, you want to somehow move it this way, right? So it makes sense that you have extensors on the opposite side of the flexors. Now here we have the hip joint. And which muscle groups? So we have two general muscle groups. We have this group right here and this group right here. So which group do you think will help in abduction? So again, abduction is taking away from midline. So which muscle group is going to move the femur up here and toward the side? So pause the video, think about it for a few seconds. Yeah, so remember how the flexors were on the same side of the flexion at the elbow joint? So it's not coincidental. If you shorten this right here, what's that going to do? It's going to bring the greater trochanter and the femur closer up here to the ischium. So that, or actually ilium. Ooh, caught myself there. So it's going to bring it back closer to the hip and the ilium right here. So what's it going to do? It's going to bring the rest of the femur up here. So notice that the abductors are lateral, and what we have with adduction. So if we contract these muscles and shorten it, it's going to decrease the difference or the distance between the medial parts of the femur and this part of the bone hip right here. So what we have here is actually adductors. So adductors are going to move toward the direction of adduction. So what we have here is that typically you have the muscles that contribute to a joint movement on the same side and same direction of the movement, just like we had with flexion and extension. All right.